Well, good morning, everyone. We're glad that you're able to join us today. This is the second in our Advancing Ag series. This one is titled Building Resilience Against Extreme Weather Events, Soil Health and Water Management. So we've got this is kind of a new thing for us. If you participated perhaps last month with Bruce Potter's IPM Advancing Ag webinar, you'll kind of know how this works. It's an educational series that we've developed here at the Research Center with monthly events over the course of the year under a diverse number of topics and researchers and specialists who are going to be addressing crop production topics from multiple different disciplines. So we have a number of pre-submitted questions already from participants, audience members, that we'll be answering and responding to over the course of the next hour. But before that, I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce myself and introduce the panelists and speakers today. So I'm Jeff Strock. I'm a soil scientist here at the University of Minnesota, located at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center near Lamberton, Minnesota. We've got 4 different panelists, another Minnesotan here, Anna Cates, and then 3 of our distinguished colleagues from Iowa. So I will begin with Dr. Mike Castellano from Iowa State. Mike, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself and kind of give us a little bit of background and context for what you bring to the table for our webinar today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody for joining today and taking the time to hear about what we've got going on with regard to the future of managing extreme weather events. So I'm a soil scientist and agronomist in the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State University, and my research focus is on crop production and the nutrient and carbon cycling and water processes that go on in the environment to help balance crop productivity, profitability, and environmental performance on the farm. And with regard to weather extremes, I thought I'd describe just some of the latest research we've been doing in that area. And a lot of this research relates to drainage. And so, you know, I'm sure most folks on the call are familiar with the importance of agricultural drainage to crop production in our area, especially southwestern Minnesota and the Dakotas over there, where it's expanding really rapidly, probably more rapidly than anywhere in the world right now. And so to that end, we've been thinking about how drainage functions and how it will function in a climate with growing weather extremes, and what can we do to better manage the system. So I figured I'd just show a couple of slides here real quickly. And so we all know we're all aware of the importance of drainage. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. The importance of drainage, and this is just a photo from Iowa back around the turn of the century, and an article from the New York Times talking about how Iowans had invested out of their own pockets, Iowa farmers, about as much in the drainage infrastructure of the state as the United States had invested in its contemporary, the Panama Canal. So it's a big deal, but we really haven't spent a whole lot of time updating it or thinking about it as a full society over the last 100 years or so. But as we know, drainage is really sensitive to the amount of precipitation, and the climate in the Midwest is changing. And so these are just some data from a bunch of regional weather stations, really focused on Iowa and Illinois, but you can see there is one weather station contributing to these data out there in South Dakota, right on the border, right by Jeff's territory out there, that little square on the corner of the map. And what we see here when we look across all these weather stations, and particularly at that weather station in southwestern Minnesota, is increasing precipitation, decreasing vapor pressure deficit, which means greater humidity, lower crop water use. And then on the bottom, what we're looking at there is over time, we're seeing increases in subsoil moisture across all these locations in poorly drained soils in particularly. And we think that's really a result of both the changing climate, but also the fact that drainage systems were designed for a climate that was much more, that was much drier in general. And so we've been thinking about how drainage impacts biogeochemical processes. And one of the things I really want to highlight here is oftentimes we think about how drainage exacerbates nitrate loss downstream, but perhaps counterintuitively, what we found is that improved drainage systems enhance the nitrogen use efficiency of the crop. They allow lower fertilizer applications and greater yields, largely because they improve the nitrogen cycling within the soil. They reduce the amount of nitrogen loss to the atmosphere, and they also enhance the root growth of the crops, which allows better capture of the nitrogen that is available in the system. And so Jeff asked us to just highlight a little bit about where we're going in the future. And this is a new experiment we just installed in Iowa. We're excited to work on it, hopefully in collaboration with our colleagues across the states. But we have 5 drainage systems here side by side in replicated plots that we can compare. A no drainage system, we have conventional depth and spacing, conventional depth and narrow spacing, so a higher drainage intensity. And then we have those 2 drainage intensities with shallow drainage instead. So look at how these drainage systems impact the overall nitrogen use efficiency and field operations that can be conducted in these systems. So that's just a little quick overview of where we're working towards climate extremes in agriculture. And I'll hand it back to you, Jeff. Thanks.
Saw that I was muted. So thanks a lot, Mike. That was great. I want to remind people we have questions that many people have already shared with us. But if something that Mike spoke about is sort of generating a question that you might have, you can submit those questions through the Q&A feature through the Zoom, and those will get to us, and we will try to address them as we go along. So please make sure you go ahead and use that Q&A feature in the Zoom. So next is Anna Cates. Anna.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk kind of about the soil background of why we might see some of these changes. So kind of go over how organic matter works in the soil, how it interacts with structure. This fits with my role as the soil health specialist, where we think a lot about organic matter, and my long-term research interests are about how soil organic matter functions in the soil. So this is the soil food web. And when we think about soil organic matter or soil carbon, which can be used pretty interchangeably in this context, what we're really talking about is all of these living things in the ground, starting with plants, moving through microbes and higher animals. So carbon is moving through this system as plants pull CO2 down from the atmosphere and then into their bodies, essentially. And then those bodies are transformed into microbial bodies and the bodies of larger organisms. As that happens, we're also losing some carbon as carbon dioxide, because these animals are all, well, not animals, these organisms are all like us. They eat carbon for energy and they breathe out carbon dioxide. But as they're capturing it in their bodies, that fundamental transformation from the plant material to these other kinds of carbon molecules are really important for holding the soil together. We now think about, I think, we used to think that soil organic matter stuck around for a long time, essentially if a little bit of plant material got lucky and never encountered a microbe, but got hidden somewhere where it could just remain intact forever. And now we know that getting into the microbial bodies actually is how carbon is preserved for a long time. And that's because of the how soil gets physically structured to protect that carbon. So this is a picture of a soil aggregate that shows a lot of different features. It shows how inside of a larger aggregate, there are smaller aggregates. And inside of those smaller aggregates, there are all sorts of little pieces of organic matter, which are essentially the dead bodies of those microbes that have eaten some carbon. And so you need the carbon to be processed by microbes in order to build these aggregates. That's essentially the glue that holds things together. And you also need some living organisms like plant roots, that's what these green mushy bits are, and the stringy fungal hyphae that hold together the larger aggregates. So you need all this organic matter to build the soil structure, and that gets us to the functions we're interested in, especially in extreme weather conditions. So this little cartoon shows less aggregated soil here on the left and more aggregated soil on the right, looking down at the surface of the soil. And then in the cartoon version below, you're looking at a cutaway of the soil. So this is the surface, and water is trying to enter but not able to here because the spaces between the particles are very small. On this aggregated soil, water is able to enter and flow between the large aggregates. You always have to imagine the room you're sitting in either filled with marbles where the spaces between them would be small and you would be uncomfortable, or filled with beach balls where you would have large pores between the large chunks and you would be more comfortable. That's how it is for water getting into the soil also, and aggregates create those large pores between them. But the other function we need from soil is actually almost opposite. We need it to store water for the long term. And these little polka dots I've added to the cartoon represent the ability of aggregates to hold water inside them. So soil aggregates can be key to both of these water functions that are actually kind of opposite, letting water in rapidly between them in large pores and holding water for the long term inside them in small pores. And so thinking about how building organic matter leads to this kind of function is a big part of what I'm interested in. And I'm just going to show a couple of pieces of data we have from Minnesota showing how that can happen. This is from a survey of farms across the state that Jess Gutenecht led in the last few years. And you can see the little dots on the state of Minnesota show where they measured cover cropped and non-cover cropped fields for infiltration in this case. And they have this basic relationship with what we would expect, that as the percent soil organic matter increased, infiltration was faster. One thing I want to point out is that there's not a definite relationship between the color of the points and the level of infiltration. You have some no cover crop fields that have really high infiltration measurements, probably because of recent tillage events that fluff up the soil and let the water in rapidly. So there are ways that our management is going to kind of overcome the quality of our soil so that you can have kind of fluke events like this. But in the long term and in general, practices that increase your soil organic matter are going to also increase that infiltration. In this study, they also simulated a large storm on a few of these farms. And so they were able to measure the runoff. And remember, when you have water coming into the soil, you can kind of think of it going into two pools. Either it's infiltrating, that first pool I talked about, or it's running off, carrying sediment and nutrients with it. And so you do have the opposite relationship between soil organic matter and runoff. There's a lot fewer data points in here. And once again, it's not 100% correlated to cover crop use. But I just wanted to use my intro time here to point out this relationship we know about between organic matter and soil water behavior so that we can be thinking about those functions as we answer these questions going forward.
Oh, Anna, that was awesome because, as we, again, for everybody who's on, use that Q&A feature to add new questions for us. But, Anna's striking at a couple of the questions that we'll get to in a couple of minutes here, directly related to using cover crops and how that may be impacted by future heavy weather events and precipitation events. So thanks, Anna, that was great. Marshall, you are next up, sir. Marshall, you're muted.
Can you all see my screen, my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Marshall McDaniel. I'm an assistant professor in the agronomy department at Iowa State, and I specialize in soil-plant interactions. And what I want to bring up, or maybe kind of pose a couple more questions. I really liked all of your questions that Jeff has been sending us. But I want to pose a couple questions regarding this kind of what I call the environmental trifecta. And that's between soil health, water quality, and greenhouse gases. And I'm going to come back to this, but before I do that, I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due. So these are the folks in my lab that makes everything run and is the base of all the hard work that gets done in my lab. And I've got collaborators on the left, Morgan Davis, Emily Waring, and Matt Helmers. Matt and Emily are at Iowa State. Morgan was a postdoc in my lab. He's now at University of Missouri. And this was funded by USDA, NEFA, and also the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And what I want to do, and then everybody else is in, folks in my lab or have recently left the lab. If you do have any questions that I can't get to today, please email me at marsh@iastate.edu. And you can follow all the stuff, the cool stuff that these folks are doing in the lab on Twitter at soil_plant_IXNS, which stands for interactions. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the environmental trifecta. So there should be some connection between soil health, greenhouse gases, and water quality. In fact, under soil health, one of the best ways I like to define soil health is just an assortment of soil ecosystem services. Many of them actually are related to greenhouse gases and/or water quality. And I think about this a lot, and whether or not we can have all of these things at once, right? There are environmental outcomes for all three of these things that we'd like to see. And with that comes the question, are there trade-offs amongst these three components of environmental outcomes? So in other words, can we increase these? So this is kind of a conceptual diagram. The outer edges of this triangle are where water quality, soil health, and greenhouse gases are optimized. This is kind of the current where we're at. And the question is, can we manage systems to enhance all of these things, right? So let me pull my laser pointer up here so I can point better. However, one thing that I've noticed, actually even prior to this work I'm going to show you, I did some work as a postdoc in Australia in a long-term no-tillage experiment. And we found that no-tillage frequently increased the soil health and water quality aspect, but under no-tilled systems, we often get greater greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, and actually CO2 release. So I'm going to come back to that, but that's just a little kind of anecdotal evidence. And there's been other studies that show maybe increases in soil carbon are actually offset by emissions of gases like nitrous oxide. The other question I want to bring up that I'm going to delve into a little bit more is the idea of stacking conservation practices. So using more than one conservation practice. So I've got some hypothetical data here. Conventional tillage, no tillage, the bold highlighted practices are the conservation practice, then no cover crop and cover crop. So we might expect you get a little benefit or outcome from cover crops. And then under no-till, we might get a little bit more benefit. And this would be called an additive or non-synergistic effect or neutral effect. However, one of our questions was, well, is that really true? Could it be that there's actually synergy when you combine conservation practices, and do you get an enhanced outcome that's greater than the sum of the parts? So this is something that my former postdoc Morgan, now at University of Missouri, was working on for the past 2 years, and we're just coming out and publishing some of that data now. And this, I just wanted to show one graph, and I'm going to take some time to explain this because it does show this connection between soil health, water quality, and greenhouse gases. And it's quite a complex graph, so I'm going to take my time to explain it to you all. So we've got our conservation practices here. No tillage versus tillage are colored in orange and also indicated by the shape, so circle versus a square. Tillage and no tillage, so the circle and square that are green with rye means that this practice is no tillage plus rye. And then we also had a pasture system. And the context for the experiment is that this was about a 10-year experiment where we implemented these treatments. There's tile drainage under it. Matt Helmers is world renowned for running these tile drain experiments, kind of the same idea what Mike had talked about, the same kind of experimental design. So we can measure the nutrient losses from under each of these treatments very precisely. And then we can, my former postdoc also measured greenhouse gas emissions, and we summed, there wasn't a lot of methane that came out of these soils, but it was mostly nitrous oxide and CO2. So he summed these into what's called greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalents. And so the nitrate leaching is on the x-axis, the greenhouse gas emissions are on the y. So we're looking at this trifecta, and then the size of these bubbles is actually a common soil health metric called the Co2 Burst Test. Some of you might be familiar with this, being part of the Haney test. We also did some other measurements that I'm not going to show those data here, but aggregate stability and some other kind of common physical and chemical soil health measurements that I'm not going to show, but they also aligned with these findings, meaning the pasture had greater metrics of soil health than any of the crop systems. But the other thing you'll notice here is that there's a trade-off between greenhouse gases and nitrogen leaching. And what I mean by that is that the systems that have a lot of nitrogen leaching had low greenhouse gases, but when you reduce the leaching, you're actually increasing the potential for that system to release nitrogen as nitrous oxide and have greater greenhouse gas emissions. And again, what if we were to judge the health of these soils based on just one metric, the CO2 burst, that would have been the pasture, but that was one of the soils that had the greatest greenhouse gas emissions. Now, another caveat here is that we haven't measured, well, we are, but we don't have the data yet for soil carbon. So if we included soil carbon to offset these greenhouse gases, this graph might change a bit. But my experience with soils in Iowa and central Iowa in particular is that they take a long time to observe changes in soil carbon. So I am skeptical that there's going to be any differences amongst these treatments in soil carbon. And the other thing that is not included in this figure is life cycle assessment. So greenhouse gas emissions based on the management and other factors, nutrient additions. The pasture doesn't receive any nutrients and not even manure. So it's kind of an unusual, it gets hayed and there's green manure there, there's red clover in there, but it's a little bit different than what we might think of as a pasture system with actual live animals on it. So anyways, I just want to point out that it does seem, at least from this preliminary work that Morgan Davis did, is that there are trade-offs, and it seems to be between soil health, water quality versus the greenhouse gas emission. Again, with a qualifier that it's just the soils. We haven't assessed the life cycle assessment yet, what the emissions from all those other practices, nor the any changes in carbon. But what I think this means is that we need to either make tough choices and or get creative with management practices. And I liked Mike's slides because that is kind of a thinking out of the box kind of management practice where we can manipulate drainage to maybe where we can get some more of these kind of a win-win-win situation, right? Where we get improvement in all of these the environmental trifectas. And actually, that's all I wanted to show. I've got some backup slides if people have questions, but thanks, Jeff, and thank you. And let me know if you have any questions. It looks like there might be a few questions online.
Oh, Marshall, thanks. That this is going to turn out to be really, really good. I see that somebody typed a question into the chat. So just a reminder, on the bottom of your screen, right next to the chat button is the Q&A button, and you can type your questions, the real-time questions, into that box. It'll help us kind of navigate the questions rather than in the chat. The very last person to introduce is Claire Phillips. She's also in Iowa with the USDA-ARS. And Claire, enlighten us with what you want to share about yourself and your work, and then we'll hop into these questions. This is going to be exciting.
Okay, let me see if I can do this right. Do you see my PowerPoint?
We can.
Okay. Thank you everybody for coming today. So I'm new to the family here, and I recently relocated from Oregon. So I'm with the USDA-ARS National Lab for Agriculture and Environment in Ames. And previously I was located in Corvallis, so where I worked on many questions related to drought adaptation, like can we use biochar for improving soil moisture? Can we grow hops with deficit irrigation? So now I'm shifting to looking at dealing with excess moisture. And I just wanted to mention some of the projects that I'm starting. So we're looking at improving restrictive soils with annual ryegrass. And I know that there's some annual ryegrass interseeders in Minnesota. So I just wanted to mention that because I think there may be some lessons learned that will be applicable in Minnesota too. Looking at soil water dynamics under cover crops, and also looking at working with Mike, looking at questions of drainage impacts on deep carbon. And one of my research passions, I guess, has for a long time has been, let me see if I can advance the slides, thinking about soil climate and how do we describe it and how can we manage it. And so a few years ago, I looked at this question of how much will soils warm? We know how much, we have predictions of how much air will warm. And so I looked at global climate model predictions for soil temperatures and aggregated those and described those. And the answer is that soils will warm, are predicted to warm just as much as air is, even at considerable depth, as long as there's no snow. And snow has this insulating effect. And so in thinking about how is changes in snowpack going to affect soil warming, and then of course affect management and pathogen cycles and root growth and cover crop performance, there's a lot more work that needs to be done here, both to describe soil temperature trends and to develop predictive models of it. So that's one thing I'm working on in collaboration with the USDA Climate Hub, which is also located with us in Ames, and state climatologists across the Midwest is trying to pull together those long-term soil temperature trends. And my hypothesis is that if the changes in snow cover and spring thaw will lead to considerable more chaos because depending on when things thaw out, less snow can mean either warmer soils. Less snow can also mean colder soils. And so it will be important to get a handle on these soil temperature changes. I didn't describe this figure that well, but I'll just briefly say, so this is showing air temperature and soil temperature predictions over the century. This is showing where there's snow, like in the boreal, or even across the Midwest and grasslands, there's this offset with soil temperatures warming more slowly than air temperatures. If you look down in the desert or in the tropics, those lines fall right on top of each other. And of course, changes in soil wetness and thinking about how are these changes in soil climate going to affect soil function. I think one of the most important issues is more rain and more extreme rain will affect soil erosion. And this is a simulation for the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where it's the same thing that we see in the Midwest, where we're getting increases in precipitation at times when there aren't crops on the field. And so we see more runoff predicted over the course of the century. And each of these lines is a different global climate model downscaled to the region. And also a lot of this is driven by stream bank erosion from increased stream flows. And as we think about our management options, area of research that I'm interested is looking at how cover cropping affects soil water dynamics, and can it improve excess soil moisture? Can we, in the spring, can we use the ET of cover crops to try and remove excess water? And there is some evidence that cover crops are using spring water, and here's the meta-analysis that shows cover crops improved water drainage. But at the same time, cover crops, and as well as other conservation practices, can allow the soil to hold more water. And this was our one of our long-term research studies at the NLAE. And last October, the cover crop treatment was the only one that still had green corn in October. All the other treatments were dried out. So we do see that sometimes cover crops are increasing soil water storage, and sometimes not. So this is complicated, and is a topic that I'll be working on in the future. So that's all. And I'm happy, I'll share my contact information as well. I'd be happy to follow up with people.
Thanks a lot, Claire. That was great. So this really kind of sets a really nice stage. There's a number of live questions coming in, and so I think maybe we'll tackle those first. And then if I see a nice segue between one of the live questions and one of the ones that was done during the pre-registration, we'll do that. So we had this question, maybe really to everybody, but maybe specifically to Anna and Marshall about carbon. And the question was really related to, it seems like it takes a long time to really develop all that carbon that we want. And is there anything that can be done in the short term to capture some of that carbon to kind of help, build momentum in the system?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, that it just takes a long time to build soil carbon. Soils change slowly, soils build over millennia. And in terms of anything we can do quickly about carbon in the soil, that's probably not very likely. People see fast changes in surface carbon. They sometimes see fast changes in especially coarse textured soils, but there's nothing we can do everywhere that will change carbon rapidly. Maybe Marshall or Mike have some more, or Claire have some more ideas.
Yeah, I'll just say that, and the reason why that is the process that Anna is talking about. So change in a system, it takes a long time for soils to build soil organic matter again after we've lost about 50% since cultivation a couple hundred years ago. But there's also inherent problems with how we sample it. So there's a lot of variability spatially. And even when you sample through time, so might be sampling the same field through time, the way you sample and the way the sample's processed before it goes into the machine that gives you the soil organic carbon also generates a lot of error and contributes to our inability to say that this management has changed carbon significantly from another one. It's scientific jargon for how we like to say there's statistical differences between certain treatments.
I want to chime in too, and then I'll segue into a piece I know that Mike's done a little bit of work with, and that's related to this whole thought of the carbon. I recently read a paper that was published, I think it was about the last 5 years, from Scandinavia. Long-term study, had small grains, some corn in it, and the paper was really talking about soil structure and carbon, and it was really putting an emphasis on the fact that the carbon gains that they were seeing in this 50-year study were really related to the below ground biomass. So they were really relating it to the gains in carbon related to roots, not really quite as much from the above ground component, the stover, for example. And, I know, Mike, I kind of alluded to, you've done some root work. Marshall, you and Matt have done some work down in the Marsden plots down there in Iowa. Maybe you guys might want to chime in, are there other, is it as simple as cropping system diversification? Or maybe Claire or Anna related to the cover crops to get more roots in there. What in the short term might be helpful?
Yeah, Jeff, I guess the way I like to think about carbon, at least, is just like your bank account, right? If you want to increase the balance of your bank account, there's two approaches you can take, right? You can go out and make more money, you can get a second job, or you can stop spending money, right? And either way, the balance will accumulate in your account. And so, taking that analogy to cropping systems, there's two ways we can increase the amount of carbon in them. We can increase the annual inputs that we get from crops, whether it's roots or above ground materials that are worked into the soil through tillage, or we can decrease the outputs through microbial respiration. Both those approaches will work to increase the carbon balance. And what we know is that decreasing the outputs is a much more effective way to increase the amount of carbon in a system than trying to increase the inputs. It's a much faster way, I should say. And good evidence of this, I'll share a picture real quick, is the Bog Man from Denmark. And so this guy is over 2,000 years old, buried in a bog in a wetland in Denmark. And when he was discovered about, I think, 5 or 10 years ago, they were able to study the contents of his stomach and brain because he was so well preserved, because the soil was completely saturated, there was no oxygen, and no carbon outputs as a result, despite the fact that the carbon inputs still come from above. So that's the way I kind of like to think about it.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I've been thinking recently about it, in terms of soil health, right? So there's carbon sequestration as a soil function that, we want to encourage. But apart from just building soil carbon for maybe a just-in-case scenario, right? There is the soil health perspective where we're monitoring a suite of indicators, including active carbon is one of them. And time and again, in my experience and also in the literature, that active carbon is really responsive to management, to conservation practices. And I think a logical extension of that is, well, let's provide active carbon when we need the soil biology to be active, when we want nitrogen to mineralize in the spring. And that can be accomplished through cover cropping, right, as this input of active carbon. And that rapidly cycling carbon can stimulate the biological activity, and it gets consumed, right? And that it's driving the living soil system. It may not lead to an accumulation of soil carbon for the long haul, but it is feeding the biology. So, yeah, that's an additional perspective.
Yeah, I have one more thing to add on that too. While reducing outputs of carbon may build carbon in the long term, keeping inputs like stover in an annual crop system is shown to be critical just to maintain the carbon we have in the system. So for people managing corn and soybean rotations, the amount of residue that they keep around can be really important to maintaining their soil organic matter levels.
So we just had a question pop in that relates to what Mike said. So a person is asking, is there an ideal % carbon for healthy soil? And I see lots of smiles coming up on the screen up there. Anna, your picture's up. Why don't you go ahead and take a stab at it first?
No, you start, Mike. It was yours.
Well, okay, yeah, I was going to say, Anna, so there's been some real nice meta-analyses lately and also experimental work that has kind of looked at this question: is there too much organic matter in some cases? And not necessarily that the organic matter itself is hurting crop production, but that the high organic matter levels are more of a symptom of what I just talked about earlier: too much water in the system that's kind of slowing down the microbial processes and the nutrient cycling of the system. And that work seems to find that a regional corn belt scale, 2.5% organic matter seems to be the magic number for like the surface 6 inches or foot of the soil. But, you know, clearly that's a very rough estimate, and, you know, there's a lot of nuance in that from operation to operation and location to location.
You know, Mike, I want to kind of come back to that. You know, the majority of our context, you know, that we're talking about, you know, you think about, you know, the areas that you guys have done work in and that we've done work here in Minnesota. You know, a lot of it is, you know, is these finer texture soils, the Des Moines low, relatively high organic matter soils. But it made me start to think a little bit, you know, we may have some folks who are listening who, you know, live in places like central Minnesota or central Wisconsin, some of these sandy soils where, you know, even getting up to 1%, you know, they'd be really happy, right? And so 2.5% seems almost unachievable unless we're throwing, you know, cover crops into the mix and those kinds of things. So I just, you know, not that there's a question posed in there, but more rhetorical that, you know, we got to have a target, right? And, you know, to try to make sure that we're attaining something that is advantageous not only for, you know, crop production, but also for the environment. And that kind of segues me into a question that was related to greenhouse gases. And there was a question posed about integrating livestock. Is integration of livestock necessary to help draw down greenhouse gases, or is animal agriculture the cause of excess greenhouse gas emissions? So Marshall, I see you smiling up there. Maybe you want to try to address that one a little bit.
Yeah, I think this question gets at a root of a broader issue, but I appreciate it's kind of a contentious answer or a contentious question, maybe looking for a contentious answer. What I think the question is going at is, you know, can we sequester carbon and save the world? And the answer is probably not, without also reducing sources of emissions. And by probably, I mean likely not. It's a input and output with regard to the size of the sink in the atmosphere, the size of the bathtub. And we can drain a little bit out into soils, but we also have to reduce what's coming out of the tap from sources. And energy is a large sector, right? There's a lot of other sources that we can do a good job reducing. But now bring it back to the specifics of the question, the animals. I mean, I think this is a really intriguing idea, and I've only started doing work on kind of integrated livestock systems. And there seems to be something with reintegrating animals back onto crop fields that you can't get without them alone. So the data I showed, again, it was kind of an artificial pasture system. There actually aren't animals on it or manure, but there are a lot of benefits from the manure. People find there are benefits just from the grazing, and I'm talking about multiple soil health aspects. So, you know, water holding capacity, carbon storage, having the animals actually graze and stimulate root activity. That seems to be a very important part of reintegrating animals into cropping systems too. And that's all I'll say. Maybe pass it to some of the other panelists.
I'll just say I saw recently one of the highest soil carbon accumulation rates ever reported was in the Southeast, with conversion of degraded cotton and peanut fields to pasture with managed intensive grazing rotations. It's a feature of greenhouse gas inventories on agricultural lands. that the main emissions are methane and N2O. And even if, as you sequester more carbon, it's often not enough to compensate for the N2O and the methane. And so we can presume that's going to be the case as well with livestock integration. And there are reasons to improve the soil and to that are beyond the greenhouse gas inventory, right? So I would agree with Marshall. We're not going to offset emissions or even necessarily agricultural emissions with carbon sequestration, but there are many reasons to improve soils.
You know, I think this is really, it's been kind of an interesting little dynamic, because when I think about, you know, what you were just saying, Claire, and then reflecting back on what Marshall said, and then Marshall's sort of really cool three-dimensional pyramids figure that he showed, you know, at the very end of the day, it kind of came back to relating to my thinking of trade-offs, right? You know, there isn't going to be, you know, we need to have healthy soils for productivity, for growing food, for, you know, clean water and those kinds of things. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there are going to be trade-offs. And of course, we're focused in on agriculture, and we're talking about, you know, drainage and carbon and greenhouse gases right at the moment. And you know, you're talking about, you know, sources and sinks, and you know, we also have to remember that, you know, agriculture isn't the only source and the only sink that's out there, right? And so it's going to take, you know, when we think about this more maybe on a holistic thing, it's going to take agriculture. We're going to have to do our part, and everybody else is going to have to be doing some of their parts in order to kind of think about, you know, how that whole sort of global carbon budget and things go. I want to jump to a question that was directed to Marshall. So Marshall, this one, and Mike, this will relate a bit to the new research plots that you showed. So the question was, are there any controlled soil health drainage field experiments that are looking at soil health, carbon content, microbial health influences on the fate and transport of emerging contaminants like PFAS or pathogens that are being introduced via field irrigation or manure and fertilizer? So there's a lot there, but I guess, you know, and Anna, actually, you could contribute too, related to Lindsay's plots, I suppose. But, you know, in terms of new experiments looking at soil health, carbon, microbial things, maybe you guys want to, you know, chime in a little bit on some of the, a little bit more on some of the cutting edge things. Mike, you didn't really elaborate too much on those new plots, but, and Anna, maybe you could talk about some of Lindsay's work that's going on up in Crookston, because I think some of that might be valuable for that question.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. I could expand on that last slide I showed with those different plots with different drainage intensities and depths. So we have this manipulation of three different drainage intensities and depths. And one of the factors there relates more closely to the previous conversation about carbon. The idea is if we maintain the same drainage intensity and all we do is raise the pipes up in the soil, can we get some of those carbon benefits while maintaining the nutrient cycling and the field operations in the rooting zone? And then later on in the year, once the soils start to dry out, maybe the crops can access some of that, maybe kind of a low-tech controlled drainage style there. With regard to the question about the emerging contaminants, you know, there's been some work done in Iowa with manure, looking at what comes out of the end of the pipes. So I should have mentioned we can measure the quantity and quality of all the water coming out of each one of those individual pipes. There are quite a few of those sites, like Marshall mentioned, around the Midwest. As far as I know, not a whole lot of work has been done on on chemicals other than nitrate coming out of the pipes. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. I think the person to talk to might be Matt Helmers. He would know if there's any of that research on some of those other contaminants. I know there's a group in his department that's looking at antibiotic resistance genes, so getting at the microbe stuff too, and using prairie strips to ameliorate the movement of those antibiotic resistance genes in manure. But I'm not aware of any controlled tile drain sites. That's a good question though. I can find out. Was that Carl that asked that? I can find out for that person though.
You know, I don't know for sure if it was Carl Hokinson, I think is how his last name is pronounced. I'm not sure if he had that one or not, but you know, this question's pretty specific related to, you know, kind of controlled drainage to some degree. But I know one of my former colleagues, Satish Gupta, had done you know, a bit of work here on the drainage plots, or one of the sets of drainage plots in Lamberton on antibiotics and things of that nature at one point in time. And I know that there's some folks in Pennsylvania that are working, doing a little bit of work on herbicides, pesticides, those types of things that might be getting into water. I'm not going to make an excuse, although it'll probably sound like an excuse. But I can tell you that, you know, when people like, you know, Mike and I, and as Marshall referred to Matt Helmers, when we're measuring constituents coming out of a tile drain, for example, the nutrients are the easiest and the cheapest, least expensive things for us to measure. When we start looking at things like antibiotics or genes from different organisms, or, you know, particularly herbicides, pesticides, it becomes very expensive. And so, you know, if we someday we should do a webinar series on growing the money tree, because it would help us all, or maybe we should have a share-a-thon and try to raise money for our research through doing a webinar. But it gets to be really expensive and somewhat challenging to do, because sometimes those constituents are at such low concentrations that you have to have a huge amount of water to be able to detect them. So again, not really excuses, but there are some limitations to doing some of those things. Marshall, did you have something else you were gonna? Okay.
No, I sent a message. It was Jeff Standish.
Okay.
Jeff S. that asked that question. So I'll find out for him and email him. I'll ask him.
Oh, great. Excellent. Well, thanks for the question, Jeff. So here's another question, and we didn't really address this much, and that is really kind of related to, I'll say, economics of some of the things that we're talking about. And Mike, this was a specific question to you, but has there been any thought to tracking fuel efficiency in your drainage plots? So, you know, kind of doing an economic budget, if you will, in sort of looking at relating that to trafficability and how it might be a benefit to having the drainage out there because of some of that.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great question. So like one of the things the undergraduate workers in my lab always remind me of is that walking in a really wet field takes a lot more energy than walking in a nice, well-drained field to go out and collect those soil samples. Our engineer who kind of focused on those fuel efficiency and tractor efficiency operations recently retired, and so I'm looking for a collaborator who would be interested in that, but it's something we're definitely interested in tracking. And we think drainage definitely does have an impact on. Actually, in terms of the greenhouse gas budgets, a couple of things that drainage probably impacts beyond just obviously leading to soil carbon loss because it oxidizes the soil, it aerates the soil. It also reduces nitrous oxide emissions, probably reduces or increases methane consumption. So its effects on greenhouse gas balances are complex, but then it also has those potential other effects on greenhouse gas balances if it takes less diesel to operate those drained fields. If, for example, the albedo of a drained field, if it reflects more light, a well-drained field back to the atmosphere than a poorly drained soil because the soil is wet and dark. A lot of things to consider.
Yeah, that's yeah, like you said, Mike, that's complex. I want to throw this to Anna because I know that Anna and I worked on a proposal a year ago, and she had this relatively simple but ingenious idea about tracking sort of field working days related to soil health, and it would relate to, you know, carbon, soil structure, drainage. Anna, do you want to make any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that fits in the research upcoming category. We took some data in 2020 and we're going to continue in the next couple of years looking at soils under different farm management, basically tillage and cover crop regimes before and after rainfalls to track both moisture and structure, with the idea being that maybe you can get out there earlier because it's drying down faster, that infiltration effect, or maybe you can get out there faster because the structure is holding you up even when it's moist. So we're just starting to look at data from that, but I think it is a really interesting question. You know, this intersection between water and carbon is not only of interest from the global climate change perspective, it's also of massive interest, as this question pointed out, from the people doing the work on the ground. You know, those are some of the most stressful days, I think, in the farmer calendar is the day you want to get out and you're not sure if it's dry enough. So if we can show clearly that certain systems are going to be more conducive to timely field work, that's a huge win for anybody managing a farm operation.
You know, and Anna, I want to chime in along with that. Just, you know, when you think about some of the topics that we've hit on today related to the drainage, you know, related to some of the cover cropping pieces and, you know, some of the, you know, diversified rotation work I know that Marshall's done and that we're doing here at Lamberton, that, you know, we all clearly understand some of the challenges of farmers being able to make money in diversified systems when we're asking them to grow small grains, but there can be some of these other dramatic, you know, soil health benefits. There can be, you know, some of these soil physical benefits where you're looking at different times of the year that you may be able to have increased the infiltration capacity of that soil, and that's advantageous in the long run. There's a question here in the other category that I really like, and I'm gonna throw it out to you guys. I know we're getting close to our noon time, but I want to throw this out. So the person says, I realize the scale of farming operations, local versus a big ag, is variable, but asking the panelists if you could discuss a little bit how your research or your research work interacts or draws on indigenous tribal knowledge related to their management of the soil. I think that's an absolutely fantastic question. And, you know, I'm wondering if any of the three of you left, I know Mike had to leave, if any of the three of you left have you know, considered, you know, sort of our Native American, you know, experiences in any of your work, or how that might be advantageous to us.
I can start with this one because we actually have a project with anthropologists, and we're partnering with a few Native communities around the Midwest, the Omaha, Menominee, hopefully the Meskwaki soon, and others. And it actually gets at that diversified system you're talking about, Jeff. So we wrote a proposal to get Native gardeners and farmers involved with doing some citizen science, so measuring their own soil health and starting their own experiments on what's colloquially known as the Three Sisters, so planting beans, squash, and corn together, which is an indigenous practice. We're still kind of gathering data from this experiment, and COVID kind of put the kibosh on one of our first growing years. But I think it's really important to, and there's a lot, not just out of Native American communities, but there's a lot of importance of what's called traditional ecological knowledge and how things are being rediscovered that indigenous folks have known for thousands of years. And like a recent example, I saw a paper, I think in Nature, where they discovered it's the one native palm tree in Australia. They didn't confirm that it was native until recently when they did DNA sequencing, but the Aboriginal people there had known for a long time, and they had stories about that palm tree. So I think we shouldn't dismiss these indigenous and ecological knowledge of traditional folks, and that thing should be incorporated into how we can manage systems to have greater soil health, less greenhouse gas emissions, and sequester carbon too, and improve water quality.
Thanks, Marshall. I wasn't aware you guys were doing some of that work, and that is awesome. You know, I'd say, you know, for my own personal experience, we had a couple of projects where we were trying to work with some of the folks in the Upper Sioux community here, related to water and water quality. And, you know, those would be areas of interest that we would have. So if people are out there listening and have interest in those things, you know, by all means, contact us. The other thing that I'm sure you probably are all aware on the panel, that a couple of years ago, I think it was, that there was a really interesting paper that came out of UW-Madison in Wisconsin about the maize, the corn that's grown down in Mexico at elevation by the indigenous people, with very little to no nitrogen fertilizer at all. And there were some hypotheses about the biological activity and these mucilages that were in the soil that allowed this crop production to go on. So you know, those are, I don't think we probably have anybody from Mexico on our Zoom today, our webinar, but you know, there are some really interesting things out there, you know, that we could probably benefit from and share between us. You know, I see we're just after 12. There's one question I feel, just as like, even though the moderator, but I'm the drainage guy, the official drainage guy in the group here, to answer one of the questions that was submitted before our session today, and that was tile drainage is an essential water management tool, and I think we would all agree with that. And the question was, is there any need to be concerned about restrictions in the future? You know, I've actually responded to this question now for a second time, and I don't know who submitted that originally, but you know, the answer that I'm going to give is the same. Is that, you know, across the upper Midwest, we have millions of miles of drain pipe, you know, in the ground. And I'm going to speak for all of us on the panel that, you know, we all want to have, you know, healthy, productive farmers that are able to be economically viable. But we also want the systems that we're operating in to try to avoid as much regulation as absolutely possible, to be, you know, having those sort of environmental quality things in our brains. And so, you know, I don't see that the infrastructure of drainage systems is going to go away at all. But what I do see is related to some of the things that we have talked about a little bit today, and that was alluded to in one of the other questions about, you know, controlling the drainage, you know, using tile spacings, tile depths. You know, are there going to be some management strategies that we can use, and that this would also include cover crops? Are there some strategies that we have in our toolbox already that we can use to, you know, manage that water to try to retain as much as we can on the landscape, A, for crop production, and B, you know, for improvements in water quality. So I know it's a tricky thing, but you know, I think that the drainage is here to stay. We're just going to have to we're going to have to be diligent in how we manage it. Yep, and Marshall threw a thing in the chat there. So he mentioned, you know, we also have these edge of field types of practices, and I will tell you as we kind of end up getting ready to close out here that I think for myself, the next webinar, Advancing Ag Series webinar that I'm going to lead will be on some of those edge of field practices, bioreactors, constructed wetlands, saturated buffers, those types of things, to help people think about the tools in their toolbox. So before I give my concluding remarks, Claire, Anna, Marshall, do you have any final things you want to say? as part of the webinar.
It's been a great conversation. Thanks, everybody.
I guess I would just add that these discussions about carbon and sequestration and climate change are really challenging. They're really technical. They are like, trying to judge like how much is something going to make a difference as far as carbon sequestration and, what is the path forward? These are really difficult things that I'm grappling with as a researcher, and I've been looking at soil carbon for 15 years. But I appreciate everybody that is participating and wanting to engage with this issue. And I'd say they're in trying to figure out what makes sense. How much carbon can we sequester? Are these certain practices going to make a difference? There aren't a lot of shortcuts to getting the information we need. There are a huge number of studies with inconsistent results, right? And so we're all in the same boat together. And I know that's not very satisfying, but I just appreciate people like staying tuned in as we all kind of try and work through this together.
Excellent comments, Claire. The truth be known right there in your statements. Perfect. Marshall, how about you? Any final parting words?
I just want to say thanks for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, just echo Anna and Claire's statements too, that this is a good discussion. I'm glad you're hosting these, Jeff. And I'll come back anytime you invite me.
Awesome. I hope you will all be willing to come back. I think, we'll probably need to revisit this, maybe we'll focus one session at some point just on the carbon question instead of, dumping in the drainage and the carbon and all these other pieces, because there's a lot of interest obviously in that topic, and it's certainly not going to go away. So, obviously we lost Mike Castellano. He had to leave the part a little early, but I want to thank all of you for participating. You made this this day fantastic. If all of you that are still out there, you see there's a link that Emily has put into the chat. Please fill out that form. It gives us some feedback on this Advancing Ag webinar series event and future ones. So beg of you to please go ahead and use that link. I believe everybody who registered, Emily will probably also be sending a link to you to fill that out, because I know some people, it looks like they had already had to leave. The last thing here, our next Advancing Ag webinar series event is going to be March 24th, so 1 month from today. And my colleague, Dr. Paolo Pagliari, he's going to lead a discussion on smart manure management. So, we danced around a little bit of that subject today, and there's going to be a whole session on it in 1 month's time. And there is going to be future information about our Advancing Ag series. I see that Emily put that up in the chat. It's that z.umn.edu/advancing-ag. And you can always go to our SWROC, our Southwest Research and Outreach Center website, and that link is also there. So again, thanks everybody for participating today. I know we went a little past the 12 o'clock, but appreciate everybody chiming in, and especially my colleagues who participated today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.